Hey, Simon here, and today I'm back with a game art trick, and this time it's about the Wings of Angels in Diablo 3. Already in Diablo 2, I really liked the design of Tyrael and I loved the animation of his wings. And not only you can admire them in the great cutscenes, no, in Diablo 2 you could also see Tyrael and his wings in the game. And interestingly, these wings are not mirrored. These are two separate files, each containing 60 frames of sprite animation. And when Diablo 3 was announced, I was very interested how they would realize these wings in a 3D engine. Because sure, you could just render out an animated texture and map it to a plane, but this would cost a lot of texture memory. Or you could use skin geometry, but as you see here in my example, this would cost a lot of bones. So however it's made, there are several problems to solve. First, the starting point of the wings must be fixed, and you need a nice and wavy movement, and the wings should get thinner towards the tip. So I looked at their assets, and to be honest, I had no idea how they made these beautiful wings out of such simple textures. And it's just important to mention that I'm just assuming here. I don't really know how it was done, but my experiments come close. So first let's talk about the motion. Okay, it's easy to understand that you get a nice wavy movement if you map a sine wave texture to a plane and move it along, but the starting point moves up and down. And as I just mentioned, we need a fixed point where the wing is attached to the back of the angel. But by looking at the geometry, you can see the trick. They deformed the plane so that the up and down movement gets reduced on one side. And if you add some subdivisions, you avoid the weird texture stretching, as you can see here. Still, you have a slight up and down movement, but this is good enough because the area where the wings connect to the angel are pretty big and allow at least a bit movement. And by the way, you can use the additional subdivisions to add some deformation to the geometry so that it looks, for example here, faster and stretched at the beginning and gets slower and compressed at the end, which adds some nice variation to the animation. And just a note, instead of deforming the geometry, you could just modify and deform the UVs. But for better presentation, I did it here by deforming the geometry. Now let's remove the opaque blue areas around the sine curve, and here the alpha channel of the sine texture comes into play. And as you can see here, we get a nice wavy string texture moving along the plane. And it's interesting that these small plasma fringes almost seem to have a bit life already, even without any extra animation or something like that. So the only problem here is that we can see a hard cut on the right side of the plane, where the wave texture ends very abrupt. And the left side isn't a problem because there it connects to the angel's armor and this will hide the harsh cut. And this problem can be solved by using a second texture as a mask. Of course, instead of using a mask texture, you could also use vertex color for that. But I think with a texture mask, you just get a bit more control over details. So here you can see how the applied mask improves the wing experience. And very interesting, the transparency in addition with the slightly squashed geometry makes the end of the wing looks thinner. And as you surely remember, this was one of the problem zones we had to solve. And now let's get to some variation. If you copy your plane several times and rotate it a bit, you can get wings which look similar to the ones in the Diablo game. And to get some variation, you can offset the UVs a bit, so that you don't see the same part of the sine wave at every part of the wing. But as you can see, this produces several problems. One part of the solution is that you clamp the texture. The problem is that our modified UVs now reach over the UV border. And we can solve this by clamp, which means that the border values of the texture are repeated forever instead of the whole texture like it would happen when you wrap it. And here you can see how clamp solves this issue. But we have one problem left. And to avoid that last problem, we can just stretch our UVs so that it aligns to the mask again and we avoid the harsh cut. Another solution to this problem would be to just use a second UV layout. So we can modify our first UV set as much as we want, and for the masking, a second UV layout would be used which does not have UVs which overlap out of the UV space. But even with using a second UV layout, you may run into problems like you can see here, where you can see some pixel bleeding, and this can be solved by just set your texture to clamp, and then the problem is solved and all looks perfect. And if you now use a bit more complex geometry like the one in Diablo 3 and not just boring planes, the effect gets even better. The curved surfaces add some volume and avoid that all the stuff looks flat if you look at it from the side. And even if this looks complicated to you, you should remember that these guys are just deformed planes like you can see here. And just a side note, there are some planes without subdivisions, and yes, they suffer from some weird texture stretching like explained before, but this gets very well hidden in all the movement going on. And also these planes seem to use a different mask texture, but I might be wrong here. And if you are interested in seeing the UVs of this geometry, here you go. So let's bring it all together. If we apply our material to the wonderful geometry we just saw, it looks like that. And at least in my opinion, it looks really similar to what we can see in the game. But it seems that there is even more detail added. There's a pattern texture, but I wasn't sure how it's used. But Lewis83 suggested it could be multiplied with the mask texture. And I think this is really likely to be true. As you can see here, it adds really nice additional detail to the whole effect. And if you are interested, on my blog in the article you can find the whole material how I set up it in the Unreal Engine to recreate that effect. So basically that's it, but there is one issue I would like to speak about, it's secondary motion. I think these rings look really stunning, but if the NPCs move around, there is no secondary motion, there is no dynamic, they just stick to the NPC. This is not a major issue, but got handled in the next Blizzard game. Heroes of the Storm improves the rings in that regard, and as you can see here, if you move Tyrael around, the rings adapt dynamically, which looks really nice in my eyes. And here you can see the textures which are used in Heroes of the Storm. They look similar to what we saw in Diablo, and here you can see the rings, how they look in the main menu. And as you can see here, not only that the textures are moving along the geometry, no, this time also the geometry gets deformed. And by the way, I think these rings are a great example of how game development often works. We constantly have to overcome problems which look intimidating at first, but can be beaten by using several small and creative solutions. Thanks for watching, I hope you liked what you saw. Leave me a comment or send me any feedback you want, and have a nice day.